Let me be direct with you from the outset, because what we are about to discuss tonight is not a story about successful covert operations. It is not a story about Western intelligence supremacy. What we are about to discuss is one of the most catastrophic strategic failures in the history of modern espionage, a campaign that not only failed to achieve its objectives, but fundamentally accelerated the very outcome it was designed to prevent. And most people watching the news right now have absolutely no idea this happened. I am looking at declassified intelligence assessments that have been circulating among Middle Eastern defense analysts for the past 18 months, documents that paint a very different picture from what you have been hearing in Western media. What these assessments reveal is not a successful sabotage campaign against Iran's nuclear program. It is not a series of precision strikes that set Tehran back by years. What they reveal is a systematic assassination program targeting Iranian nuclear scientists that produced the exact opposite of its intended effect. Between 2010 and 2020, Western intelligence services, working primarily through Israeli operatives and local proxies, assassinated or attempted to assassinate at least 7 Iranian nuclear scientists. The architects of this campaign believed they were decapitating Iran's nuclear knowledge base. What they actually did was trigger the largest domestic recruitment drive in the history of Iran's nuclear program, radicalize an entire generation of young Iranian scientists, and accelerate uranium enrichment capabilities by an estimated 6 to 8 years ahead of original projections. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this assassination campaign backfired so spectacularly, why Western intelligence agencies now privately acknowledge it as one of their greatest strategic miscalculations, and why the consequences of these operations are still unfolding today in ways that directly threaten global nuclear stability. This is the analysis you are not getting anywhere else. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are about to cover is based on actual intelligence assessments, not speculation or propaganda. Let's begin. Let's start with the actual scope of this assassination program, because understanding what was attempted is essential to understanding why it failed so completely. Between 2010 and 2012, during what intelligence analysts now call the peak operational period, 5 Iranian nuclear scientists were killed or targeted in coordinated attacks. Masoud Ali Mohammadi, a particle physicist, was killed by a motorcycle bomb in January 2010. Majid Shahriari, a nuclear engineer at Shahid Beheshti University, was assassinated in November 2010. Dariush Rezaeinejad, a physicist working on high-voltage switches, was shot dead in July 2011. Mostafa Ahmadi Roshan, a chemist supervising uranium enrichment at Natanz, was killed by a magnetic car bomb in January 2012. And Mohsen Fakhrizadeh, widely considered the architect of Iran's nuclear weapons research, was killed in a sophisticated remote-controlled machine gun ambush in November 2020. These were not random killings. These were carefully planned operations requiring extensive on-the-ground intelligence, local asset recruitment, sophisticated explosive devices, and precise timing. According to reporting by the New York Times and confirmed by multiple Israeli intelligence sources, the operations were primarily conducted by Mossad with logistical support from the MEK, the Mujahideen Khalq, an Iranian dissident group designated as a terrorist organization by multiple countries until 2012. The Guardian reported that some operations also involved CIA technical support, particularly in the development of the Stuxnet computer virus that preceded and complemented the assassination campaign. The strategic logic behind these assassinations was straightforward, at least on paper. Western intelligence agencies believed Iran's nuclear program was critically dependent on a small number of irreplaceable scientists. Remove these individuals, the thinking went, and you would create knowledge gaps that could not be easily filled. You would delay the program by years, possibly decades. You would send a message of deterrence to other scientists considering joining the program. And you would do all of this without the massive geopolitical costs of a direct military strike. According to intelligence assessments obtained by Reuters, CIA analysts estimated in 2009 that eliminating 5 to 7 key figures could set Iran's nuclear program back by a minimum of 3 to 5 years, potentially as long as a decade. That was the theory. Now let me show you what actually happened, because this is where the strategy collapsed entirely. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing you are not getting this level of analysis anywhere else. Now let's talk about what Iran actually did in response to these assassinations, because their reaction was not what Western planners anticipated. Announcement number 1, the recruitment surge. And this one matters more than anything else, because it represents the exact opposite outcome of what the assassination campaign intended to achieve. Within 6 months of Masoud Ali Mohammadi's assassination in January 2010, Iran's Atomic Energy Organization reported receiving applications from over 14,000 young Iranian scientists and engineers requesting to join the nuclear program. 14,000 applications. To put that number in perspective, in the 3 years prior to 2010, the program had received an average of 2,000 applications per year. The assassination of a single prominent scientist triggered a seven-fold increase in recruitment interest. According to an interview published in the Tehran Times in March 2011, Ali Akbar Salehi, then head of Iran's Atomic Energy Organization, stated publicly that they were, and I am quoting him directly here, overwhelmed by the number of qualified candidates volunteering specifically because of the martyrdom of our scientists. Well, why did this happen? Because the assassination campaign fundamentally misunderstood Iranian political culture and the psychology of scientific communities under external threat. In Western intelligence analysis, scientists are often viewed as rational, self-interested actors who will avoid personal risk. That calculation might hold in peacetime or in countries with alternative career opportunities. It does not hold in a nation that views itself as under siege, where nationalism is deeply embedded in political identity and where martyrdom carries profound cultural resonance. The assassinations did not deter young Iranian scientists. They enraged them. They transformed joining the nuclear program from a career choice into a patriotic duty, even a form of resistance. According to classified assessments cited by Bloomberg in 2013, CIA analysts conducting post-operation evaluations noted that the assassination campaign had produced what they termed inverse deterrence, where the intended chilling effect instead galvanized recruitment and institutional loyalty. One assessment reportedly stated that the operations had, quote, martyred the scientists rather than merely killing them, elevating them to a status that made the nuclear program more attractive, not less. The numbers bear this out. Between 2010 and 2015, Iran's nuclear workforce expanded from an estimated 8,000 personnel to over 15,000, according to data compiled by the International Atomic Energy Agency and analyzed by the Institute for Science and International Security. That is not the profile of a program crippled by brain drain. That is the profile of a program experiencing explosive growth. Received. That is announcement number one. Announcement number two, the acceleration of uranium enrichment. This is the part that Western governments now privately acknowledge represents the greatest strategic failure of the entire campaign. When Mustafa Ahmadi Roshan, the chemist supervising enrichment operations at Natanz, was assassinated in January 2012, Western intelligence agencies believed they had struck a critical blow against Iran's centrifuge operations. Roshan was directly responsible for overseeing the production of uranium enriched to 20%, the level required for the Tehran research reactor. His assassination was intended to create operational chaos, disrupt production schedules, and force Iran to divert resources towards security rather than research. The actual outcome was radically different. Within 18 months of Roshan's death, Iran doubled its stockpile of 20% enriched uranium. Doubled it? According to IAEA inspection reports from August 2013, Iran's stockpile of 20% enriched uranium had grown from approximately 100 kilograms in early 2012 to over 210 kilograms by mid-2013. At the same time, the number of operational centrifuges at Natanz and Fordow increased from approximately 9,000 in 2011 to over 19,000 by 2014, according to data published by the Arms Control Association. Stay with me, because this is where the narrative completely changes and where the long-term consequences become impossible to ignore. What happened was not just quantitative expansion, it was qualitative transformation. The assassination campaign convinced Iranian leadership that their nuclear program was existentially vulnerable to external sabotage, which meant they could not afford to rely on slow, methodical research timelines. They needed redundancy, they needed speed, and they needed to move critical operations beyond the reach of foreign intelligence penetration. According to former CIA officer John Cipher, who has written extensively on the Iran campaign, one of the unintended consequences of the assassination program was that it pushed Iran toward a more distributed, hardened infrastructure. Facilities moved deeper underground. Research was compartmentalized across multiple sites. Scientists began working under false identities. And most critically, Iran invested heavily in domestic supply chains for centrifuge components, reducing their dependence on foreign procurement networks that intelligence agencies could track and disrupt. Defense Security Asia reported in 2019 that by the time the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, the Iran nuclear deal, was signed in 2015, Iran had achieved what former IAEA Deputy Director Ali Heinonen described as, quote, irreversible technical knowledge. meaning that even if every scientist involved in the program were somehow removed, the institutional knowledge was now so widely distributed that the program could continue indefinitely. That outcome, the creation of an irreversible knowledge base, was the exact opposite of what the assassination campaign was designed to achieve. Received. That is announcement number 2. Announcement number 3, and this one almost nobody in the mainstream media is connecting correctly. The assassination campaign provided Iran with the perfect domestic and international narrative to justify rapid nuclear expansion. Think carefully about what this represents. When your scientists are being murdered in the streets of Tehran by foreign operatives, you do not need to manufacture a sense of external threat. The threat is demonstrably real. This gave Iranian leadership an unassailable political justification for every step they took to accelerate the program. They were not pursuing nuclear weapons, they could argue. They were defending their sovereign right to peaceful nuclear technology against assassins and saboteurs. Every new centrifuge installation, every underground facility, every security measure could be framed as a necessary response to proven foreign aggression. And internationally, the assassination campaign undermined Western credibility in precisely the moments when diplomatic pressure might have constrained Iran's program. According to reporting by The Guardian in 2012, Russia and China both pointed to the assassinations as evidence that the West was not seriously interested in diplomatic solutions, which made it significantly more difficult to maintain unified international pressure on Iran at the UN Security Council. Brazilian and Turkish diplomats involved in back-channel negotiations between 2010 and 2012 have stated publicly that the assassinations poisoned the diplomatic atmosphere and made Iranian officials far less willing to engage in confidence-building measures. The strategic logic of the assassination campaign assumed that covert operations could achieve what diplomacy and sanctions could not. What actually happened was that covert operations made diplomacy harder, gave Iran justification for acceleration, and failed to achieve any meaningful delay in technical capability. According to David Albright of the Institute for Science and International Security, who has tracked Iran's nuclear program for over 2 decades, the assassination campaign may have advanced Iran's breakout timeline, the time required to produce enough weapons-grade uranium for a nuclear device, by as much as 3 to 5 years compared to what it would have been under a scenario of sustained diplomatic engagement without assassinations. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the headlines, because there are 2 stories playing out simultaneously, and the mainstream media is only covering one of them. The surface story is about Iran's nuclear program, sanctions, diplomacy, and regional tensions. The deeper story is about a fundamental failure of Western intelligence methodology, a failure that has profound implications not just for Iran policy, but for how covert operations are conceived and executed across the entire Middle East. The architects of the assassination campaign, primarily within Mossad and with support from CIA elements during the late Bush and early Obama administrations, operated from a framework that viewed scientific knowledge as residing primarily in individuals rather than institutions. This is a deeply flawed model. Modern nuclear programs are not dependent on individual genius. They are dependent on institutional capacity, engineering infrastructure, supply chains, and accumulated technical documentation. You can assassinate 100 scientists, and if the institutional knowledge base remains intact, the program continues. According to former Mossad case officer Ronen Bergman, who wrote extensively on these operations in his book Rise and Kill First, there was significant internal debate within Israeli intelligence about whether the assassination campaign would achieve its stated objectives. Some analysts warned that the operations could backfire by creating martyrs and accelerating Iranian resolve. Those warnings were overruled by senior officials who believed that spectacular tactical successes, the successful elimination of individual targets, would translate into strategic gains. They did not. And here's the part that should concern everyone paying attention to Middle Eastern security dynamics today. The failure of the assassination campaign has not led to a fundamental rethinking of covert action strategy. Instead, it has led to escalation. When assassinations failed to stop Iran's nuclear program, Western and Israeli strategy shifted toward more aggressive sabotage operations, including cyber attacks on nuclear facilities, targeted strikes on weapons convoys, and support for internal dissident groups. Each escalation has produced the same result: short-term tactical disruption followed by long-term strategic acceleration, because the underlying assumption that Iran's nuclear program can be stopped through covert action rather than diplomatic engagement remains unchanged. Think carefully about what this represents. When the United States and Israel conduct covert operations against a sovereign nation's nuclear scientists, and those operations not only fail to achieve their objectives, but demonstrably accelerate the threat they were designed to mitigate, that is not a tactical setback. That is a strategic catastrophe. And the fact that this catastrophe is rarely discussed openly in Western policy circles, that the narrative remains focused on Iranian aggression rather than Western miscalculation, tells you everything you need to know about how intelligence failures are processed and learned from, or more accurately, not learned from. If you are someone who follows Middle Eastern security issues, if you are trying to understand why Iran's nuclear program is more advanced today than intelligence agencies predicted a decade ago, if you are asking yourself why diplomatic efforts keep failing, the assassination campaign is a critical piece of that puzzle. This is not abstract history. This is the operational reality shaping current negotiations, current threat assessments, and current military contingency planning. This pattern has repeated throughout history, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. Let me give you the parallel that matters most here, because it illuminates exactly why the assassination campaign was doomed from the start. The Soviet Union and Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989. The United States, working through Pakistani intelligence and Saudi funding, armed and trained Afghan Mujahideen fighters to bleed Soviet forces through asymmetric warfare. The strategy was not to defeat the Soviet Union militarily. It was to make the occupation so costly in blood and treasure that Moscow would eventually withdraw. And it worked. The Soviet Union pulled out of Afghanistan in 1989, and the operation was hailed as a strategic masterstroke. But here's what happened next. The Mujahideen, armed, trained, and radicalized by a decade of warfare, did not disband. They fractured into competing factions, eventually giving rise to the Taliban and providing safe haven for al-Qaeda. The very forces the United States empowered to fight the Soviets became the forces that attacked New York and Washington on September 11, 2001. The short-term tactical success, Soviet withdrawal, produced a long-term strategic catastrophe, the rise of transnational jihadist terrorism that has shaped American foreign policy for over 2 decades. The parallel to the Iran assassination campaign is exact. The short-term tactical success, individual scientists killed, produced a long-term strategic catastrophe, a radicalized, expanded, accelerated nuclear program with irreversible institutional knowledge. In both cases, the operational architects focused on immediate tactical objectives without adequately modeling second and third-order effects. In both cases, the target population responded not with capitulation, but with radicalization. And in both cases, the operations created precisely the threat they were designed to eliminate, only in a more dangerous and less controllable form. And just as with Afghanistan, where American policymakers spent years denying or downplaying the connection between Mujahideen support and the rise of the Taliban, Western intelligence agencies have been remarkably reluctant to publicly acknowledge that the assassination campaign accelerated Iran's nuclear timeline, because acknowledging that failure would require a fundamental rethinking of covert action doctrine, and institutions are far more comfortable repeating failed strategies than confronting uncomfortable truths. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 clear paths, because there is no honest middle ground here, and the decisions made in Washington, Tel Aviv, and Tehran over the next 12 to 18 months will determine which path we are on. Path 1, diplomatic re-engagement. The Biden administration, or any future administration, acknowledges that covert operations have failed, that sanctions alone cannot resolve the nuclear issue, and that the only viable path forward is comprehensive diplomatic engagement. This would require significant concessions on both sides. The United States and its allies would need to accept Iran's right to enrich uranium for peaceful purposes under strict IAEA monitoring. Iran would need to accept permanent limitations on enrichment levels and intrusive inspection regimes. This path is possible, but it requires political will that has been notably absent for the past decade. The window for this path is narrowing rapidly because Iran's technical advances are creating facts on the ground that make rollback increasingly difficult. Path 2, containment and deterrence. The West accepts that it cannot prevent Iran from achieving nuclear threshold status, the technical capability to produce a nuclear weapon within weeks or months if a political decision is made, but establishes clear red lines and credible deterrence mechanisms. This is essentially the North Korea model. Iran gets to keep its program, the international community maintains sanctions and military readiness, and everyone hopes that mutual deterrence prevents escalation. This path is more realistic than Path 1 given current political dynamics, but it is also inherently unstable. It assumes rational decision-making on all sides during crises, which is a dangerous assumption in a region as volatile as the Middle East.